A woman walking her dog near Highway 522 and Echo Lake Road in Snohomish on August 25, 1990, came across something no one should ever have to see. There, off the roadside, was the body of a teenage girl. She had been missing for days. She had been hurt in ways that told investigators this wasn't random, wasn't sudden, wasn't a fight that got out of hand. Someone had taken control of her life, ended it, and then left her behind as if the world would keep moving and never notice. That girl was Michelle Koski. She was 17 years old. For more than 3 decades, the man who killed her remained unnamed. The file stayed open, the questions stayed sharp, and the years kept stacking up. Then, long after the neighborhood had changed, long after the people who worked the first hours of the case had aged into retirement, the answer finally came into view. But by the time Michelle's killer had a name, he was already dead, and that changes everything. Michelle Koski's story doesn't begin at the roadside where she was found. It begins in North Seattle, in the Lake City area, where she lived and where people later tried to piece together what her last week had looked like. The official record is spare, and maybe that's part of what makes this case hit so hard. There isn't a long public biography. There isn't a stack of interviews telling us every dream she had or every room she once lit up. What does come through is that she was very young, living a life that made her vulnerable, and moving through spaces where danger could step close without much warning. She wasn't protected by routine, by money, by status, or by the kind of attention that can force the world to stop when someone disappears. Girls like Michelle could slide out of sight fast in 1990. That's not because their lives mattered less. It's because the systems around them often acted like they did, and that truth sits under this whole case. On August 18, 1990, Michelle was last seen near her house in the 13300 block of 30th Avenue Northeast in Seattle. Earlier that day, she had been at an apartment in the 6200 block of 14th Avenue Northwest. Investigators later came to believe that at some point she left to meet someone for a drink. That detail matters because it places Michelle in a familiar kind of situation, one that sounds casual, ordinary, almost forgettable. A ride, a meeting, a few drinks, a person she may have known a little, or maybe barely at all. Nothing about that setup announces itself as the beginning of a murder case. That's one of the cruelest parts of crimes like this. The final decision a victim makes can look so small from the outside. One moment you're still inside the loose rhythm of a Saturday. The next, you're in a car with the wrong person, and no one else knows the clock has started. A week passed before Michelle was found. That gap is an ache at the center of the case. 7 days is enough time for fear to spread, for rumors to start, for people to wonder whether she would walk back in on her own, whether someone had seen her and forgotten it, whether the answer was sitting in front of them and they just couldn't recognize it yet. When the woman with the dog found Michelle's body on August 25th, the case changed from a disappearance into a homicide, and all the possibilities narrowed into one brutal fact. Michelle had not drifted away. She had been taken from the world by another person. The place where she was found also mattered. It wasn't her neighborhood. It was a site far enough away to suggest movement, planning, and the confidence of someone who thought distance would protect him. A body left near a road tells its own kind of story. It says the killer believed this place was good enough. It says he thought he had already won. Investigators would later say Michelle had been sexually assaulted and murdered. A detective explained the belief that the man who met her likely intended to have sex, that Michelle didn't want to, and that she probably tried to run. He believed the killer ran her down and strangled her. Another detail made the case even harder to hear. Investigators said the person who killed Michelle used pieces of concrete from a nearby pile to finish the attack. That is violence at close range. It is ugly, physical, committed in real time by someone making decision after decision to keep going. Nothing about that points to panic. Nothing about it suggests hesitation. It points instead to domination, rage, and the kind of indifference that lets someone leave a teenage girl at the side of a road and carry on with his life. When people talk about murder, they sometimes flatten it into a single act. But cases like Michelle's remind us that murder can be a sequence, a chain of choices, each one crossing a line the killer could have stopped at and didn't. From the start, this was not an easy case. Michelle's life circumstances made the investigation harder. Young women who were moving through unstable situations in 1990 often did not receive immediate, unified attention from the public. Witnesses were harder to pin down. Timelines came with gaps. People who might have seen something sometimes didn't want to talk to police, didn't trust them, or couldn't remember enough to help. And even when detectives worked hard, the structure around the victim could shape the case in ways no one wanted to say out loud. A teenager from a secure home with a tightly documented schedule might leave behind a trail of appointments, names, and alarms. Michelle's trail was thinner. That didn't make her case less deserving. It made it more dependent on patient detective work, on forensic luck, on the possibility that somewhere in the evidence there was one thing a killer couldn't take back. At the time, no one knew that one thing would be DNA, and no one knew how many years it would take before science could really speak for her. The early 1990s in Western Washington were already marked by fear around violence against girls and women. That wider climate matters because it shaped how cases were felt and how they were remembered. To the public, one homicide could blur into another. Names got lost. Faces faded. Certain victims were remembered with books, specials, and anniversaries. Others slipped into the background, carried mostly by their families, a few detectives, and the people who couldn't forget. Michelle's murder lived in that painful space for years. Not gone, not solved, not at peace. Just waiting. A case file like that becomes its own kind of time capsule. Inside it are photographs, notes, forensic reports, addresses that may no longer look the same, names of people who moved or died, and a version of the city that no longer exists. Every unsolved file also holds a quiet accusation. It asks whether the dead person mattered enough for someone to keep turning pages after everyone else has gone home. For Michelle's family and the people who knew her, those pages never really closed. Publicly, we know of one friend, Melissa Johnson, who had known Michelle since they were about 10 years old. When the break in the case finally came, Johnson spoke about how often she wondered what Michelle would have become if she'd lived. That's such a simple thought, but it's the whole tragedy in one line. Not just how Michelle died, but everything her death stole from the future. Jobs not worked. Loves not found. Rooms never entered. Small, ordinary mornings never lived. We often talk about murder in terms of justice, and justice matters. But before justice there is absence, and absence is what families carry year after year. Birthdays arrive. Holidays return. The age of the victim starts to look impossibly young. Then one day the family is older than the victim will ever get to be, and the wound changes shape again. That's the part of a cold case no evidence log can fully record. In 2005, the Snohomish County Sheriff's Office assigned Detective Jim Scharf and retired Detective David Heitzman to a newly formed cold case team. Heitzman chose Michelle Koski's case as a primary case to lead. That decision probably felt practical on paper, but in reality, it meant something much heavier. It meant reopening a life that had ended 15 years earlier. It meant sitting with old photographs and old pain, and deciding that what had not been solved in 1990 still deserved hours, labor, and belief in 2005. Cold case work isn't glamorous. It is repetition, patience, and the willingness to reread something everybody else thinks has already been read enough. It is also faith in the idea that evidence can outlast memory. Detectives can retire. Witnesses can move away. Neighborhoods can be rebuilt. But a trace left at a crime scene can wait in silence for decades if it's stored, protected, and eventually met by the right technology. Michelle's case would prove exactly that, though not quickly and not without frustration. When detectives reopened the case, they had DNA, but they didn't have the answer they needed. There was no match in CODIS, the national DNA database used to connect known offenders and crime scene evidence. That matters because people sometimes hear that a case had DNA and assume the rest should have been easy. It wasn't. A profile without a match is like having a voice on tape with no name attached. It tells you someone was there. It tells you the killer left something behind. But if that person has never been entered into the system, or if the profile is complicated, you can still be staring at the same wall years later. According to the sheriff's office, detectives spent the next decade ruling out suspect after suspect by collecting DNA and comparing it. That kind of work can feel both hopeful and punishing. Every exclusion clears one path, but closes nothing. Each person ruled out says the killer is still out there, unnamed, living his life under the shelter of time. That long middle stretch is where many cold cases die for a second time. Not because anyone officially gives up, but because the energy around them thins out. Budgets change. Staff changes. New crimes demand immediate attention. Meanwhile, the dead remain exactly where the file left them. Michelle's case could have stayed there forever, locked in the half-light of an evidence room, and revisited only in anniversary coverage or brief mentions on lists of unsolved murders. Instead, the science moved. Investigative genetic genealogy began changing what was possible in cases where the killer's DNA existed, but no direct database hit did. The idea sounds almost futuristic. Use a crime scene sample to find distant relatives through public genealogy databases, then build family trees backward and forward until the branches narrow toward a person who fits. But behind that idea is patient, detailed labor. Every family line has to be checked. Every relationship has to be mapped. Every assumption has to be tested. In Michelle's case, even getting to that stage required solving another problem first. The DNA sample from Michelle's crime scene was not clean and simple. It was a mixture of Michelle's DNA and her killer's DNA. That might sound like a technical footnote, but it was actually a major obstacle. If you upload a mixed sample into genealogy analysis without separating it correctly, the results can send investigators in the wrong direction, including toward the victim's own relatives. Parabon Nanolabs worked on the case, and the company later described the scene sample as especially challenging. Their bioinformatics team had to deconvolute the mixture, in other words, untangle the combined DNA so the genetic trail would point to the perpetrator rather than produce a confusing blend. That step is easy to glide past when hearing a solved case summary, but think about what it really means. Michelle's killer had hidden in the evidence itself, blurred into the biology of the girl he murdered. To identify him, scientists had to pull the two apart decades later, one line from another, almost like restoring a torn document you were never supposed to be able to read again. Once the usable genetic profile was created, the case moved into a different kind of investigation. A digital DNA file was uploaded to public genealogy resources, including Family Tree DNA and GeneMatch. Then genetic genealogist Deb Stone spent about a year building family trees, tracing relationships, and following the logic of inheritance across branches of people who likely had no idea their distant DNA connections would someday help solve the killing of a teenage girl. This is where cold case work starts to feel almost unreal. A murder in 1990. A roadside in Snohomish. A victim who had waited decades for answers. And somewhere, far outside the original scene, relatives of the killer had uploaded data while researching ancestry, heritage, maybe family curiosity, maybe nothing more dramatic than wanting to know where their grandparents came from. The path from that curiosity to Michelle's case is astonishing. It also raises a quiet human question. How many lives touch a murder case without ever knowing it until the day the name is announced? The genealogical work eventually led investigators to two brothers. One of them was Robert A. Brooks. According to the sheriff's office, Brooks had been born on April 25, 1967. He had been released from prison on April 18, 1990, just months before Michelle was killed. He was living with a relative in the 12500 block of 25th Avenue Northeast in Seattle, only a few blocks from where Michelle lived. That geographic detail lands hard. After years of distance, complexity, and advanced science, the suspect turned out to have been nearby all along. Not in another state. Not hidden under an assumed name in some far-off place. Nearby. Close enough that the city Michelle moved through and the city her killer moved through overlapped in the same map squares. It's the kind of fact that makes a solved case feel even heavier because it turns the killer from a faceless possibility into a local presence. He had streets. He had addresses. He had days after the murder. He walked around in the same world that Michelle had been denied. By the time Robert Brooks was identified, there would be no arrest, no interview room, no trial. Brooks had died in King County on October 26, 2016, of natural causes. He was gone 6 years before the public announcement named him. Cold case resolutions can be emotionally complicated for that reason. On one hand, the answer matters. It matters deeply. The family gets the truth. The victim gets her name tied to the man who did this, not to rumor, not to the word unknown. Investigators can say they solved what once seemed impossible. But the absence of a courtroom leaves its own emptiness. No jury hears the facts. No guilty verdict is read out loud. No defendant has to sit there and face the weight of what he took. In Michelle's case, the science outran time, but only by a little. If the tools that existed in 2022 had existed years earlier, what then? Would Brooks have been arrested? Would Michelle's family have heard his name while he was still alive? That question can't be answered now, and it lingers. Even with Brooks dead, detectives still needed to confirm that the genealogy had landed on the right man. They did that by testing a blood sample from Brooks with help from the Snohomish County and King County medical examiners and the Washington State Patrol Crime Lab. The result, according to the sheriff's office, was a positive match to the crime scene DNA profile. The statistical strength of that match was staggering. The estimated probability of randomly selecting an unrelated person from the United States population with the same profile was 1 in 1.2 quadrillion. Numbers that large almost stop sounding real. But what they mean in plain language is simple. The science pointed to Robert Brooks with extraordinary force. This wasn't a guess sharpened into a headline. It was a conclusion built from old evidence, new methods, and layers of confirmation. After 32 years, Michelle's case was no longer just a file about a murdered teenage girl found by the side of the road. It was a solved homicide with a named killer, and that changes how history holds her. There's another reason Michelle's case matters beyond the science. It shows what persistence looks like when the victim did not come from a life that would automatically command public sympathy or endless media attention. The system often works unevenly. Some victims are instantly turned into symbols of innocence the public can embrace. Others are described by the hardest parts of their circumstances and left there. When that happens, a quiet moral sorting begins. The public doesn't always say it out loud, but you can feel it in the coverage, in the urgency, in the length of memory. Michelle was young. She was vulnerable. She was, by multiple accounts, living in ways that exposed her to risk. None of that excuses what happened to her. None of it lowers the value of her life by even a fraction. If anything, it should have increased the urgency around protecting her. Cases like hers force us to confront how often society treats vulnerability as if it's a choice that waives your right to safety. Michelle's murder stands as a hard rebuttal to that idea. Think about the week after August 18th, before Michelle's body was found. Somewhere during that week, people who knew her had to sit with uncertainty. Maybe she would come back. Maybe she was out there and just unreachable. Maybe this wasn't yet the thing they feared it was. Then the call comes. Then a location becomes fixed in everyone's mind. Highway 522, Echo Lake Road, Snohomish. Once a body is found, the imagination starts doing what it always does. It traces roads. It counts miles. It tries to picture the last minutes. In Michelle's case, detectives later believed she had tried to flee. That belief is one of the most heartbreaking details in the file because it gives you a flash of her fighting for her own life. Not passive, not resigned, running. The distance between being offered a drink and running for your life must have closed in an instant. We don't know her exact words, the exact look on her face, the exact point where fear became certainty. But we know enough to understand that Michelle resisted, and that matters. It matters because murder victims are often frozen in the public mind as still images. A yearbook face, a file photograph, a body beneath a sheet. But Michelle was a moving person in her final moments. She made decisions. She reacted. She tried to get away, if investigators are right. That means her story is not only one of victimization. It is also one of effort, will, and interrupted survival. There is dignity in remembering that. A killer can take a life, but he doesn't get to define the victim only as helpless. Michelle's resistance also says something about the man who killed her. He did not merely attack someone weaker. He had to overcome someone who did not agree to what he wanted and would not go along with it. That is often the center of crimes like this. Entitlement colliding with refusal. The violence becomes a punishment for the victim's independence, her boundary, her no. Once you see that pattern, the case stops looking like random danger and starts looking like something even more familiar and ugly. Robert Brooks had been released from prison in April of 1990, according to the official release. Public reporting noted that he had previously been convicted as a juvenile. The precise contours of his earlier life are not all laid out in the material that's publicly available, and maybe that's fitting. It's Michelle who should remain at the center. Still, that release date carries a hard weight. April 18th. For months later, Michelle is dead. That short span compresses the case in a way that almost hurts to contemplate. It means the man who killed her had returned to the community, and, within months, a 17-year-old girl was gone. We don't know from the public record whether Michelle knew him by name, recognized him in passing, or had never seen him before that final encounter. But we do know proximity mattered. He lived only blocks away. A predator doesn't always arrive from nowhere. Sometimes he exists in the same local geography as the victim, woven into the ordinary background until one decision turns him into the most important thread in the room. When the sheriff's office announced the identification in June 2022, the public language was measured but emotional. After more than 30 years, Michelle's family could finally be given answers. That sentence sounds clean. In real life, answers arriving after 32 years aren't clean at all. They come mixed with relief, grief, fury, and the strange disorientation of learning something huge after you've spent so long preparing yourself for the possibility that you'd never know. Families of homicide victims often talk about being stuck in two times at once. The calendar moves forward, but emotionally part of them stays with the day everything broke. A late answer can reopen that day with shocking force. Suddenly the old case is in the news. Cameras come back. Reporters call. The killer has a name. People ask for statements. And the family has to feel the past and the present at the same time. That isn't closure in the neat sense people like to use. It's more like a locked door finally opening onto a room you still didn't want to have to enter. For detectives, too, a cold case solve is never just a triumph. It's also a measure of how long the victim had to wait. Jim Scharf and David Heitzman had spent years on Michelle's case. Public accounts emphasized that Scharf methodically ruled out a long list of suspects, and that the eventual solve was a fitting finish to a distinguished career. That's true, but look underneath the praise, and you see something humbler: stubbornness on behalf of the dead. Detectives can't undo a murder. They can't restore the missing decades. What they can do, if they're willing, is refuse to let a victim collapse into paperwork. Michelle's file needed exactly that kind of refusal. It needed somebody willing to keep testing, keep excluding, keep preserving evidence until technology caught up. In famous murder cases, persistence gets documentaries. In lesser-known ones, it often gets only a brief press conference and a little piece for a family. But that doesn't make the work smaller. In some ways, it makes it more honest. The use of investigative genetic genealogy in Michelle's case also points to a broader shift in criminal justice. For years, cold cases with usable DNA, but no Cody's match existed in a frustrating limbo. Investigators knew the killer had left biological evidence. They knew the answer was physically present in a lab sense. But without a name in the system, the science could go only so far. Genetic genealogy changed that by treating identity not as a direct hit, but as a network. A distant cousin here, another branch there. A family tree narrowed over months until one man stands where probability, geography, age, and confirmation all meet. In Michelle's case, the science had to work even harder because the sample was mixed. That's part of why this solve resonates. It wasn't just a matter of luck or a clean match waiting to be found. It was a rescue operation carried out at the molecular level. Decades after Michelle's body was left by the road, the evidence still carried enough truth to reach back through time and point. But technology, as powerful as it is, still can't do the human parts. It can't tell Michelle's family what kind of woman she might have become. It can't recreate the years lost between 1990 and 2022. It can't make Brooks hear his own name announced as the killer of a 17-year-old girl. It can't force a public that may have forgotten Michelle to suddenly understand what her absence cost. That gap between what science can prove and what justice can fully provide is important. We live in a time when solved cold cases can look almost magical in headlines. DNA identifies suspect after 30 years. Genealogy cracks unsolved murder. Those headlines are real, but they can hide the emotional math. Every solved cold case is also a story about delay. The answer arrived, yes, but not before birthdays passed. Not before parents aged. Not before witnesses disappeared. Not before the man responsible died in his own bed of natural causes rather than facing a sentence for what he did. Michelle got truth. She did not get a trial. And still, truth matters. It matters because unidentified evil leaves room for doubt, gossip, and the slow corrosion of memory. Once a killer has a name, the victim's story changes shape. Michelle is no longer just a teenage girl found dead in 1990. She is a girl murdered by Robert A. Brooks after disappearing from her Seattle neighborhood. The bluntness of that sentence is part of its value. It narrows what had been open for too long. It removes the killer's shelter. Even in death, he loses the anonymity he counted on. That's one reason cold case announcements can feel so powerful. They strip away the last advantage a murderer had. Brooks spent the rest of his life without public accountability for Michelle's death. But he does not get to keep the silence. He does not get to remain a blank space in the file. Michelle's name now carries his, and his carries what he did to her. For a victim who was left by the roadside and nearly buried under time, that naming is not small. It's a form of restoration. There's also something haunting about how ordinary some of the addresses in this case sound. A block in Seattle, an apartment on another avenue, a roadside near a highway. These are not mythic places. They are real, navigable, built places where people live, drive, walk dogs, and move through their days without knowing what happened there years earlier. Murder does that. It inserts permanent gravity into locations that otherwise look normal. Someone drives past Echo Lake Road thinking about errands. Someone lives on 25th Avenue Northeast with no idea that decades earlier the future suspect in a teenage homicide once stayed only blocks from the victim. Time smooths surfaces. It does not erase what happened on them. Michelle's case reminds us that ordinary geography can hold extraordinary pain. The map doesn't change color to warn you. The sidewalk doesn't tell you whose footsteps ended nearby. That's why memory matters, and why stories like hers need retelling. Without that, the world becomes too easy for the living and too quiet for the dead. If you step back, the whole case turns on a devastating imbalance. Michelle was 17, trying to live through a difficult stretch of youth in a world that did not protect vulnerable girls well enough. Brooks was older, recently out of prison, living nearby, and able to move through the city with more power than she had. Somewhere between Seattle and Snohomish, that imbalance became fatal. He wanted control. Michelle, investigators believe, resisted. He responded with strangulation and blunt force. Then he left her where a stranger would find her. That sequence contains everything you need to know about the moral reality of the case. It wasn't confusion. It wasn't mutual chaos. It was predation. And when predation meets vulnerability, the public sometimes gets distracted by the victim's circumstances instead of staying fixed on the predator's choices. That has always been backwards. Michelle was not the cause of her murder. The cause was a man who decided her life could be used, overpowered, and discarded. Keeping that frame intact is one way of honoring her. When Melissa Johnson said she often wondered what Michelle would have been like had she still been alive, she gave voice to the version of grief that stays active for decades. Not just missing the person you knew, but missing the person they never got the chance to become. It's one thing to mourn a completed life. It's another to mourn a life interrupted at 17, when identity is still moving, still forming, still reaching for itself. Michelle's adulthood exists only as an empty outline now. We can imagine it, but we can't know it. That's part of why murders of young people strike so deep. They don't only destroy the present. They erase evidence of the future. Whatever Michelle would have learned, changed, survived, loved, built, or regretted belongs now to silence. The best we can do is refuse to let the silence be total. Tell the story. Say her name. Remember that behind every cold case headline is not just a body and a suspect, but a life that should have kept unfolding beyond the last page of the file. So what are we left with after all these years? A teenage girl from Seattle vanished on August 18, 1990. Her body was found a week later near Highway 522 and Echo Lake Road in Snohomish. Detectives believed she tried to run from a man who intended to use her, and he strangled her and beat her with concrete when she fought back. The case went cold. A new cold case team reopened it in 2005. Suspects were ruled out for years. Then mixed DNA from the crime scene was untangled, public genealogy databases were used, family trees were built, and Robert A. Brooks was identified. He had lived only blocks from Michelle and had died in 2016 before he could be charged. The science was strong enough to name him anyway. That's the factual arc. But under the facts is the real lesson. Time doesn't heal a murder. Time tests whether anyone will keep going until the truth is strong enough to stand on its own. In Michelle Koski's case, it finally did, and even now one question keeps echoing. What would her life have looked like if she'd made it home that night?